Kara Powell and I did a lot of work together, and so when I finished my degree in Michigan State, something opened up here, and I knew Chad here, and that turned into.
Ladies and gentlemen. We're all good.
Wait, nobody left the room.
I know, we were all talking. Food
Okay.
and everything else. So do you need to set up?
Yeah, I guess I will. And
did I get the time wrong? No, 4 minutes. That's right. Was it really?
Yeah, I like barely made it on time for 3:30.
I'm sorry. I had to.
No, it's fine.
I had to work, so I was trying to respect your day.
Kenneth said him for the first time.
Anyway,
so I probably.
Oh,
But it's fine. It's fine.
okay. All right.
All right. So so that means how much time do we have?
We have like an hour.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. People are like, Steve, can you please stay all the way to 5 o'clock? Yeah.
Yeah. Is this the anchor leg?
This is it, man. You bring it home. You're the main stage.
Bring it.
Yeah. Let me get this out.
Yeah.
I'll reach out to them.
Yeah.
Sticker mule. He has the sticker mule.
Sorry for arm.
Oh, no.
You guys know sticker mule?
Heck yeah.
That's right.
Sticker mule.
I gotta wait for those discounts. They come through every
I know
month.
I've been
kinda like this.
Pins are $10.
Yeah, this is Sticker Mule. This is the Cultural Theologian Cycling Team Club.
Oh yeah.
Membership totals 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have to have
established in
you have to have a terminal degree in theology and culture and be a road cyclist. So there's this is an AI generated feasts, the Last Supper, and then this is my kids. We have avocado trees on at our place, and so I would always say farm to table Callaway Farms. You probably had some of those avocados.
I probably have.
And so for Father's Day, they made merch and some stickers. So Callaway Farms. I should have brought some avocados.
Oh, that would have. That would have.
Good ahead.
Yeah. You're let down now. Anything less than that is.
I know, we keep it.
There's like things.
Yeah. Yeah. You
Hey, at least you know yours is not.
you gotta like change the.
It's better than nothing.
Why is not good? I got
Hey, guys.
probably your end.
I was like,
Hey, Kenny.
I was like, but it was, I got it.
I've been told that I was like, hey. Go. I got some. It'll probably be you guys are fantastic.
I took it like work. Like I was like, hey, what's your guys' music? Like, oh, we can use like
I'm not gonna say that.
Open the people that signed up and say, come. You never know.
You're like, you like never seen it.
What are you doing with that? Nice.
I thought you were too.
It can be reality.
You can put me in a film, that's fine. I'll take your selfie.
Is it online?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah.
What happened? What is going on?
It's okay.
Damn.
They're doing fine. So read away.
Oh, get out of the way.
They're open. Sorry for even putting that thought into your mind. How dare you? Okay, all the ladies are over here. We're like, I just. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't
know if they Okay.
Falling out of the girl. Not even encouraged, not even.
Yeah. I really want to stick it.
All right. Tell me when you're ready to go.
All right, everybody.
Okay.
One of the things Awesome. I love about Fuller that I always admired from afar and have admired
I know what you're talking
and very proud to be here is are what these two guys embody. Okay. I think Kutter has a way of taking disparate things and bringing theology to bear on them to help us think about our human experiences in really, really fascinating ways. I think as we talked earlier about immanence and transcendence, I think that Kutter's work finds ways to speak to transcendent things in a world that doesn't necessarily have an operating system for it. And like, he's just a creative, Kutter, I'm like, you're right here. I'm talking to you like you're not here. You're just a really creative dude. And I'm just really, really inspired by your work. Things off you. It's just so beautiful. So I'm really glad you're here. What's your, I don't even know your official title. You're professor of
I don't either.
like theology and culture and
Well, actually, I was told that's not my title. So technically, I'm the chair of worship theology and arts.
Okay.
Which apparently makes me not an associate professor of theology and culture.
oh, okay.
And then I'm the dean of our PhD program.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
associate dean.
Associate dean.
Yes, all the responsibility, none of the power.
And then Kutter in his spare time, just was it a year ago now? About a year ago, he's like, I need to actually learn more about psychology. So when I went to the School of Psychology and got a PhD there as well. So he has 2 PhDs.
Wow.
And but you never. I know. It's cool. And again, I mean, I think Kutter is an example of something haunting him and him wanting to find answers for it. And I just really honor you for that, which is really great. Now, Kenneth.
No PhDs.
No PhDs, but I think about Kenneth.
Honorary.
I think about Kenneth in a lot of ways, but one of the ways that you embody what I think about is I think you helped me. You were one of my first students here at Fuller, which was really, really great. You took my class and we had a really great time. You helped me understand that students coming to seminary had other categories by which you wanted to express your faith and your theology. Like being an associate pastor wasn't necessarily what you wanted to be, or a youth pastor. You're like, I'm like creativity and film and theology and young people and ideas. What do I do with that? And I just remember conversations over coffee we had about that. And I think you shaped my teaching because I started to see different students in the room that weren't necessarily just going to be church leaders. And so for you to be working with Kutter and the work that you're doing, I'm like, of course. And it's just really, really great. And I'm just really glad to have both of you here. So let's give a warm welcome to these two. I brought them here because like Fuller's always cranking out like these really cool opportunities and things. And this is like hot off the press. So you're kind of getting like the inside scoop to some great ideas and some things that are even happening at the end of this week. And I wanted to give them a chance to speak to that. So does that sound good?
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you take it from here. Let me get out of your way.
Thank you, Steve. And we were joking earlier, since you are a demon class, we told Steve, our associate back there, and he's like, "This is a demon class." We're like, "Well, demon class." That'll be relevant here in just a minute. But you're all invited to our conference on Saturday. It's called Fear Makers, and it's all about horror. We have a couple things that I think Steve asked us to talk about. Well, I don't know if we're going to actually do that or not, and how it relates to your course, I don't know. But what I thought we would do is kind of give you a preview and workshop kind of what we're going to do over there on Saturday and see. It's like, danger, don't go that direction, or that's really interesting, say more. So we'll kind of workshop it. What I'm going to do to start off is kind of the Cliff's notes of the opening little keynote that I'm going to do over there. Now, I've never seen a stage upon which I did not want to perform. And this isn't really a stage. There's a stage over there. And so you got to imagine me doing some stuff along with this. But what you're going to see is a rough cut of some storyboarding and a screenplay. We're in Hollywood, so you interact with these screenplays all the time. Filmmakers. So this is never going to see the light of day, but it's how we're going to open it. I'll talk for a little bit, and then Kenneth's going to share about this devotional that we partnered together to make, which is a horror devotional, devotional on all of the most terrifying scriptures, or some of the most terrifying scriptures in the Bible. There will be hopefully a follow-up, so it's not all of them. You gotta wait, for more. A couple things. I think I just want to give a content warning. Both of the media pieces may have elements that are disturbing. The second media piece definitely has some language. It's offset by the most beautiful man in Hollywood. So hopefully you'll be okay. You'll hear him say horrible things, but then you look at him and go, it's all right, man. You'll see what I'm talking about here in just a second. I'm not gonna explain anything of this, just play it. Hopefully it's loud enough. Here we go. Interior, day. A man, mid-40s, looks out the window from his kitchen sink, sipping on a cup of coffee. Outside, ash falls from the sky like snow, piling up so much that it creates drifts in the corner of the yard. It's ash from the raging forest fires that have engulfed the man's town and forced his family to evacuate today. Or at least that's what he hopes. The TV in the background plays a news report about the temporary suspension of air quality restrictions in the area to allow local crematories to incinerate bodies at a more rapid pace. Corpses are piling up so quickly from the deadly virus spreading throughout the globe that hospitals and mortuaries can't keep up. To make matters worse, rumors about the virus and its origins are spreading as quickly as the virus itself. Because it's unclear exactly how it's transmitted or what the signs of infections are, everyone is now a potential threat. The news report shows aerial footage of the infected roaming the streets in hordes. Even if the virus has not yet taken their lives, they are the walking dead. Still at the kitchen sink, the man notices his children playing outside. They are making the most of the few remaining moments they have before they make their escape to a remote area of the country thought to be safe from the flames and the deadly disease. He watches as the children scoop the ash into cups and throw an impromptu tea party. Thankfully, he doesn't have to worry too much about them being outside in such poor air quality because they're already wearing surgical masks to avoid contracting the virus. Taking a mental snapshot of his kids engaged in imaginative play as the world burns around them, the man tosses his coffee into the sink and heads for the door. The man, his wife, and their 3 children pile into their battered minivan. They speed through the barren and desolate streets, windshield wipers on to clear the ash, squinting to see through the smoke-filled air. At the last intersection before they can get onto the highway, hordes of protesters descend upon their car, engulfing them in a sea of bodies. Some are wearing gas masks. Others are just screaming at each other, at the heavens, at anyone passing by. Still others carry picket signs decrying the totalitarian state or predicting the coming apocalypse. As the crowd closes in on the car, the man double checks that the doors are securely unlocked. Even before the light turns green, he senses an opening in the crowd and slams the gas pedal to the floor. He watches in his rearview mirror as the mob recedes into the horizon. Sighing in relief, he looks over at his wife sitting in the passenger seat. They exchange a knowing look with each other, and without speaking a word, they both know that their shared sense of anxiety and dread is not misplaced. This may not be the end of the world, but it's certainly the end of the world as they know it. So I call that Gabe's Kids Play in the Apocalypse, which is like a really uplifting title, right? And it could be, just a poorly written screenplay, which it is. It could be a spoof on some post-apocalyptic riff on The Last of Us. I don't know if anyone saw that. Or The Walking Dead, if there's any Walking Dead fans. Maybe you all are like not horror people at all, and you don't know what those words are. The problem is, this actually isn't a screenplay or a treatment for a horror film or a TV show. It's actually just a description of the actual experience that my family had back in 2020, where we had to evacuate from our home in Los Angeles because of an ecological catastrophe in the midst of a biological crisis that you all remember, all in the context of a national and eventually international racial reckoning. And if you remember the little detail, and just a note for us, the audio changes significantly from the first part. See, this is what we're workshopping. Right? If you remember the little detail, if you could hear it, about the restrictions, the air restrictions in LA, having to be lifted so they could burn enough bodies. I didn't make that up. That is real. It's what happened here. I also didn't make up the story about my kids before we had to evacuate, playing tea party with the ash falling from the sky. And at the time, me thinking, I'm pretty positive it's forest fire ash, but I don't know. And going, what kind of reality did I just wake up in? And to me, it's not just this is interesting or provocative or good sermon fodder. It gives sort of a whole new meaning to that question of, or the verse of dust to dust, ashes to ashes, right? The way we think about our life, the meaning of our lives, the way that we encounter each other in the world. And so the question I think that we're going to ask at the conference and that I'd like us to ask here is, okay, well then what? What then, right? Well, the truth of the matter is, even though it's kind of hard to tell the difference between a fictionalized account of my story, a very real world story, my experience isn't unique or exceptional. If we went around the room, and maybe you did at some point in the class, and you all just said, let me tell you about the last 36 months. I bet you could screenplay a pretty good story. And at some point, depending on who you are, what the details are, it might get rejected because it's unbelievable. I don't know if you've heard someone's story, like their actual details of the story and go like, man, this should be a movie. And then you're like, no, it would actually be rejected. Nobody would believe that that kind of thing actually happens. And that's because for many, if not most of us, not all of us, but for many of us, and I include the people that we're ministering to, the people that are under our care, the real world just is horrific. When we talk about horror movies and horror films, and we worry about their effect on society, whether it's kids or young people or adults, it's pretty fascinating because we go, well, wait a minute, there is nothing I have seen in the latest Scream movie or the Conjuring series, or what was the last movie? What did we see? That was awful, Steve.
Nun 2.
What? Nun 2. Oh, we just saw Nun 2 together, right? Nothing on there compares to just reality right now. And I think what we're trying to do, what Kenneth and I are trying to do, we're trying to do the conference with this book, is really just crack open a space where we can all reckon with that reality. Reckon with the horrors and the traumas and the terrors and the chaos and the catastrophe of life. Not just to be nihilistic and like, oh, you know, get lost in it, but so that it doesn't actually control us anymore. It's very easy and tempting to avoid it, to deny it, to suppress it, repress it, you know, whatever psychoanalytic term you want to take. But it takes something different, I think, to stare it in the face, to not look away, and actually grapple with where this takes us. I don't know about you, but at the same time, I'm not naive, right? And I'm not naive enough to think that I'm just going to eliminate fear from my life. Like if I just own up to it and face the horrors and be like, all right, and all done, it's good. No. And part of this podcast I've been working on, this book and the conference, in the back of my mind, a phrase that I'd had for a long time was perfect love casts out fear, right? And I was thinking like, oh, part of what we're after is to eradicate or eliminate fear from our life, to eradicate that sense of dread and anxiety that comes from everything. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. And then I realized at some point, oh, wait a minute. Now I'm running into all these other places in scripture that says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Maybe fear isn't necessarily good, bad, and different. Maybe our fears are misdirected. Maybe part of the problem, we could say the Christian problem, the human problem, isn't so much that we are afraid of things or that things are horrifying, but instead that we're afraid of the wrong things. And part of Christian discipleship is learning how to actually fear rightly, not necessarily overcome our fears. And so on one level, part of what we're doing really is how do we actually reckon with our fears? How do we name the kind of horrors and the chaos that we've been going through? But then how do we as ministry leaders, I think, ourselves and then encourage our communities to metabolize that fear, to metabolize that chaos so that it serves as food for new life. We might even say for resurrection life, right? And I want to be clear because Kenneth and I were presenting on the book a couple weeks ago, and he said something about, and it was great. And he goes, you know, we like to keep God in a box. And what if we don't keep God in a box, right? Like, what if we let Scripture itself break us out of this box? Like, oh, okay, I'm going to riff on this out of the box thing. And I was like, okay, our fears, they're in a box. No, God's in the box. But then God comes out of the box. And then and anyway, as I'm doing this and thinking about horror, I couldn't help but think about one very specific horror movie that actually is questionable whether it's horror. Kenneth says it's horror. I think it is. Some other people may or may not. But you've heard this metaphor, right? Let's think outside of the box. It's very business, cliche. I think church life, we talk about let's not keep God in a box. And I get the instinct. It's not wrong. Maybe Steve Argue has said something like, let's get outside. I don't want to, okay, good. So maybe you're into outside of the box thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm proposing, I think what Kenneth's proposing, I don't speak for him, he can share in a second, is most certainly not outside of the box thinking. I'm not smart enough, I'm not creative enough to get outside of the boxes that entrap me. And that's one of those boxes that you just saw. And that's nothing to say the fact that for horror fans, boxes are a little complicated. And here is why. Ooh, did we lose the, oh no. Hold on, maybe I have to go and undo this. This is so complicated. No, I just exit it. No. Escape. Yeah. Yes. Now bring this over. Oh, look at this beautiful man.
What's up?
Okay, let's bring it back.
Oh, come on. Such a beautiful setup. We'll have a great team. Perfect there. Okay. Just a warning. There's some language. Not seen this one. Anybody not seen 7?
Oh, no.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Look, you've made quite a life for yourself, detective. You should be very proud.
Fuck up, you piece of shit.
California, stay away from here. Stay away from here now. Don't come in here. Whatever you hear, stay away. John Doe has the upper hand.
Here it comes.
What?
I wish I could have lived like you
Shut
did.
up. The fuck you talking about?
You hear me? I'm trying to tell you how much I admire you and your pretty wife. Tracy.
What'd you fucking say?
It's disturbing how easily a member of the press can purchase information from the men in your precinct. I visited your home this morning after you'd left. I tried to play husband. I tried to taste the life of a simple man. It didn't work out. So I took a souvenir. Her pretty head.
Give me your gun.
What's going on over there?
Put the gun
I saw
down.
you with the box. What was in the box?
Because I envy your normal life.
Put the gun down, David.
It seems that envy is my sin.
Oh, what's in the box?
Give me the
What's in
gun.
the fucking box?
Give me the gun.
He just told you.
You lie! You're a fucking liar! Shut up!
That's what he wants. He wants you to shoot him.
No! No! You tell me that's not true. That's not true.
Become vengeance, David.
No, she's all right. You tell me.
Become wrath.
Tell me she's all right!
You murder a suspect, David.
No!
Just throw it all away, you know.
No!
She begged for her life, Detective.
Shut up!
She begged for her life.
Shut up.
And for the life of the baby inside of her. He didn't know.
Give me the gun, please. David, if you kill him, he will win.
Oh, God! Oh, God! Oh!
And that's when I want to stop it. Spoiler alert, something happens after this. I won't show you. What's in your box? That's the question. What's in your friends? What's in your family members' box? What about those entrusted to your care in your ministry? The reason I think I'm here, the reason Steve invited us here, is because part of what Kenneth and I try to do is, well, he's more the creative, I'm more the thinking type, but really get together and get other creatives, other folks in mental health, people in theology, people in ministry, and ask the question of what would it look like if we stared into the dark heart of reality and didn't look away. As it concerns ministry anyway, I can't think of a better place to start than in the concrete trauma of everyday life, of us asking, what in the world is in that box? We begin in the catastrophic, we begin in the trauma, we begin in the chaos, and we actually go down from there. We start by, I think, opening up this box that we know is filled with the most horrific thing that we can imagine. And we choose to dive in. So this isn't outside the box thinking. This is opening up the box and moving headlong into it, knowing full well what we're going to find. And that's not easy. And it's unsettling sometimes. I just started watching the Netflix series Wednesday today because my 13-year-old binged it without my knowledge. I was like, oh, okay. Pretty intense. Good, great. I saw the first episode and she meets with a therapist. Therapist says, we're going on a journey that will move us into uncomfortable places. And Wednesday goes, I don't travel well. That may be you. I know it feels like me sometimes. But at least the more I'm engaged in this sort of conversation, and as I kind of hand it over to Kenneth to talk about the devotional, the more I think scripture speaks to that kind of trauma, that horror, that the place that Christian ministry happens is there. Doesn't mean there's not some good times and some bright times and whatnot, but if we can't actually make sense of actual stuff that people are going through, the actual boxes that are terrorizing them, I think it's going to be difficult to do anything worthwhile, anything life-giving, and whatever ministry context we find ourselves in. So that's the sort of setup. And I wanted to then give Kenneth, segue over to him and say, that's kind of our conference. That's a bit of the podcast stuff that we're working on. Oh, be afraid if you haven't already signed up, subscribed. It just launched last week. The first episode comes out on Friday. But in partnership with this, we've also worked on this horror devotional. And so it'd be interesting to know from you, Kenneth, two things. You're the sort of, all good horror movies have origin stories. So what's the origin story of that? Because it relates, I think, to the ministry question. And then tell us a little bit about your vision for it as it unfolded.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So Wes Craven, who created Freddy Krueger, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, he says that I think of horror movies as the disturbed dreams of a society. And I think the entry point, one of the best entry points of looking at what's in the box is through stories. The whole idea of Nathan, the prophet Nathan, confronting David and not saying, hey, you killed this man, you took this man's wife to be your own. Instead, he says, there was a farmer who stole another poor farmer's lamb and like killed him. And David's like, oh my gosh, like bring him to me. He deserves judgment. And he's like, oh, that's you. Like introducing the story, because stories allow, I think, us to step into the character's shoes. And for me, in my context, I serve a Korean American church. And during the pandemic, I was hired to be a youth pastor, and I've never met my youth kids physically. It was all over Zoom. And I knew that they were on TikTok for hours upon hours a day. And what was happening during the pandemic was they were seeing images of Asian American grandmothers and grandfathers being beaten on the streets of America. So I'm thinking, how do I come into a Bible study knowing this is what they're watching and saying, hey, let's talk about this violence towards people that look like us? I tried and it didn't go well. We got to October and suddenly I just had this idea of like, dude, what if we just start with some horror stories from the Bible? And so we started with Saul raising Samuel from the dead when he was in trouble and he goes against his own word. It was really interesting. As we were going through each horror story, these kids just started coming alive. And they were like, wait, what about this man, Legion? Like, how come, like, the community asked Jesus to leave after they healed this man? And like, they started having all these questions. And then it was wild to see how listening to horror stories in the Bible helped them kind of process like their own horrors. And so fast forward to last year, I wrote and directed a horror film. I'm about to show you a trailer right now, but it's about a Korean American meth addict who has a real life demon get into his basement, but nobody in his church believes him because they've demonized him. And so the question is, what hope does someone like that have? So I'll share this and then go into the book.
Exorcisms, Pastor Lee. 제발 마약 좀 그만하거라.
봐요. 우리한테 잡힌 것 같아.
나 아버지가 그랬던 일을 갖고 있잖아.
Did your jump scare at the end?
No. Slam the table, but like, so I'm gonna pass this around. This is our book. But basically, in preparing for this film, and by the way, we're gonna be premiering the film this Saturday. So if you want to just come by and watch it and leave, that's okay, right?
Oh yeah.
You
What
don't
time?
have to pay. It's at 1:30.
1:30.
Yeah, it's only 20 minutes. But in preparing for the film, we did a lot of inductive study on the story of this man who claimed his name was Legion. So let's see, a couple of things. Like the way his society dealt with him was like to lock him up, chain him. He was away from his family, and it said that he spent most of his time in the tombs. And then, like I said, when Jesus finally kicks out Legion and the pigs are drowned, the people in this community is like, Jesus, like you need to leave, right? And one of the things that fascinated me was Jesus, doesn't like start off by saying, hey, this is a combat. I'm gonna like fight you. Instead, he's like, what's your name? He starts with like this idea of like, what's your identity here? And so we took that story and multiple scary stories from the Bible, and we got PhD students, we have Dr. Callaway, we have filmmakers, film critics, and we said, can you put together like a reflection on each one? And it will be like a Bible study on the horror stories. We approached Alabaster Bible Company, who created, quote unquote, the Millennial Bible. It's the Bible with pictures, and they're the #1 selling Bible on Amazon. And we're like, yo, Halloween is coming up. I think this would be so good. It was interesting. This is off record. I'll probably delete it later, but like one co-owner was like, heck no, or hell no. And the other one was like, no, that's like, sounds like a great idea. And so we teamed up with Alabaster eventually. We hired professional photographers, and we just gathered this team and we just imagined these horror stories. And we're hoping that young people could have like a good entry point into the gospel through a I think a medium that's really successful. It's proven to be successful. So one example is The Flash that recently came out, like an indie horror film, like beat it by millions of dollars. What's been consistent in Hollywood is for some reason, sci-fi and horror is always making profit, whereas like superhero movies are on a decline. Could it be coinciding with the horrors of our world? Like, so that's some of the questions we're asking. But it seems like these stories could help help people process maybe the horrors they're facing. And so we're hoping that this book could be a good entry point into the gospel.
I won't tell you what you should say, but there's a couple other stories you shared with me recently that's really interesting. One, there's a guy that I know that, again, around here you throw a rock and you get 10 people in the industry. So it's, but he keeps showing up and he's a friend of mine, and he keeps showing up in like major movies. He was in Barbie, isn't he? Mac is in Barbie. And I was like, he didn't tell me. And I'm like, what? I'm texting him, Mac, you're in Barbie. But he also plays a really bad dude in Lovecraft Country. And if anyone watched that on HBO, really interesting mix of horror and sci-fi and other stuff, and really compelling in terms of sort of racial not experiences, I think, and specifically the Black experience in America, retold through the horror genre. It's very meta because then in a Lovecraftian world, and H.P. Lovecraft was like a blatant racist. So it's like this remix, reworking, genre blending thing with African-American woman who directs and is the showrunner. Anyway, my friend Mac is in it and he plays a horrible dude. That's all I'll say. So we have him in and he is an out and out, like outspoken intellectual atheist, but loves talking to me about, oh, you have a PhD in theology, let's talk. So I had him on our in the studio, which used to be where Alabaster is, where all these Bibles like are sitting up, and to record our podcast. He walks in, looks down, I think it's the Gospel of Matthew, and sees and are you guys familiar with the Alabaster Bibles? Okay. He's like, oh, I'd let my kid read that. And I was like, what now? And I'm like, say more. And he goes on, he's like, oh yeah, like, he's like, why? Even how you print your Bible, like it's so intuitive, like it's like tiny and the pages are small, like who would want to read that? It's not inviting at all. He's like, but this kind of like invites me to read it. I'm like, oh, okay. And so as we were thinking about this, we go, even the way, and it's actually not a new thing. If you've seen old medieval Bibles, I mean, they're really beautiful. Prior to the printing press, you had elaborate art that always went with them, in part because people couldn't read. The sort of like visual storytelling that goes along with that isn't just, okay, how do we get young people to be involved? But it's also this question of, and I hadn't thought about it till Mac said that in that room, of going, wow, even okay, this is that sort of outside of the box thinking. I apologize. But even the way that we think inside the box in terms of how we physically print a Bible communicates to a world that couldn't care less what the Bible has to say, says a lot about what we think it is and what it does and how it should, be taken up in our lives. And so that's part of where we're thinking, man, not just that it's about the genre and these horror stories, but even the way we're actually thinking aesthetically about it is really important in terms of what it communicates. And then you have a couple stories from being at HorrorCon where people were talking, I don't know if those are all Steve's stories or yours, of people that came in and were like, oh, this is really interesting. You have a couple of those you can share?
Yeah, we were at HorrorCon last week at the LA Convention Center, and people were walking around buying like Chucky dolls and things like that. And they walk over, they're like, what is this? We're like, oh, these are horror stories from the Bible. And they're like, what? The Bible? We start opening, like, oh, the pictures are really beautiful. Like it's written really beautifully. And it's interesting. Like we were wondering if I think we'll get 2 books sold. We ended up getting like 12, which is awesome for us. And then a lot of people are coming to the conference from that. But it was interesting that a lot of them were like, oh, the Bible, like I had a certain kind of feeling about it. But when we kind of approached it with like nuance, out of the box thinking, and just like kind of honest conversation, it was really interesting to see like kind of the openness to something like this. And to talk about kind of the creative process for this, like each font, each like page, like photography, like we've actually had multiple photographers who had pictures that didn't make the book. We even have writers who wrote things that didn't make the book, meaning we had this team of going through this like in a way that we thought would be excellent. And we were like, hey, I think this font would work better for this. And had a whole art direction team thinking kind of about what we call user experience. But because what we believe, I guess, in filmmaking is like everything speaks. Like if you see a green bottle versus a blue bottle in a scene, like if it's a good director, right? And I want to be one, it's like it says something. And so we kind of took that approach with the book too.
Maybe we'll pause there if you guys have questions, thoughts.
Where can we buy the book?
Yeah.
So I brought like
Glad
40
you asked.
copies. And
Sold.
awesome, yay. And then we have a Kickstarter that's ending in a couple of days. So if you want to get it electronically, I can give you the link to that. But we have about 40 books.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can send me the Kickstarter link and I'll put it on our Canvas site too, so.
Great, thank you.
Did I not send it to you? Sorry.
What's that?
Did I not send it to you?
Well, I think you know what, I put the Fear Makers conference on there,
okay.
that Kickstarter one.
I might not have sent it. That's fine.
Send me
I'll
something,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
I
yeah.
might have- Kutter, can you talk to me more about this idea that our fears can control us, like you? And I'm wondering, like, I'm excited about this, and then there's part of me kind of going, you're asking us to step into space that I think normally, like, the public doesn't step into, other than it's almost like, horror movies almost feel like voyeurism, where like, we're just kind of like, well, this is a cool thing that makes you feel weird, but it's not really a place that I really want to go to deal with my stuff. But I kind of feel like dealing with our stuff isn't an option, like it will control us. So I feel like you're pushing on something here that's different than, we got this cool devotional about horror things that's different than other things.
Yeah.
Like I think you guys are pushing at something that's even deeper than that, like that we can't avoid. Like you're forcing us to look at something that maybe we don't really want to look at.
Oh, yeah.
You can just speak to that a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Is that fair? Is that fair?
Oh, yeah. That's why it's not out of the box. It's in the box. Yes. So again, this is somewhat new thinking. And so I'm actually a constructive theologian, which means I make things up. And it's sort of a ha ha ha, but it's also true. What I mean is that the gospel has to always be rethought every moment of every day, because I don't know what's happening tomorrow, much less 6 weeks or 6 years from now. So like our task is to like take up like, oh, we've got to actually think through what does it mean to be a faithful disciple of Jesus in this moment here. And one of those things in the here and now, so again, in 10 years, I might go, it's a little different, or 10 years ago, I would have done it said differently, is that at least the evangelical imagination is really captivated is not the right word, held captive by fears. And they come out in all these really interesting ways. And depending on who you are, they work a little differently. And we don't create space to actually process and reckon with those, either as a collective or as individuals. Now, I will say, a side note, since I have a psychology degree, there's some things, if your wife actually was brutally murdered by Kevin Spacey and you get the head and the diet, like, you need to go to therapy. You need to see a professional. That's an important space. And I think even in the church, and that's some of Kenneth's film, and actually you should stay for afterwards, because they're actually going to be talking about sort of mental health in the Asian American community, and how it's, depending upon which community you're in, it's not something that is addressed, right? Like you don't talk about it. Is that fair in terms of what your film's getting at? Yeah. And so depending upon where we're at, Christians don't always do well with things like mental health, in part because we're afraid of what that might expose. Okay, so there's that side. But then more generally, we all are driven by these things that create fear and anxiety in our life. And our tendency is, again, to avoid them, to deny them, to repress them, to ignore them. And I think if you do that, it's going to bubble up in these other places, no matter what. Somehow it's going to like come back and control you in ways that you're even totally unaware of. A horror film, you might not like horror. That's okay. Horror movies aren't the only place. But what I found is, and this both psychologically and theologically, is there's a lot of like resilience building by going into a horror movie It's fascinating, the research of hardcore and medium horror fans. They studied them during the pandemic, and they showed markedly better resiliency, mental health wise, than non-horror fans. It's fascinating, right? This is a fascinating sort of psychological insight. And the theory is it's because they're intentionally going through this practice where they're processing through and rehearsing their fear response. Like if I'm actually threatened, if I'm by whatever it is, maybe I'm threatened by random acts of violence, maybe I'm threatened by some sort of spiritual thing I can't control, maybe I'm threatened by, if you watch any of the art house filmmakers, Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, if anyone saw Hereditary or Midsommar, don't see Hereditary. It will mess you up. But this movie is a deep reflection on grief. It's just pure raw grief that this man is going through, and the way that it actually, this family inherits that grief and then perpetuates it over time because they don't deal with it. Another film called The Babadook. Anybody know this? It was at Sundance a few years ago, and a woman's husband dies. I'll spoil it for you so you don't have to watch it. And she's just like overwhelmed by grief, but she doesn't want to deal with it. She doesn't want to deal with what that requires. She has a son, and she's like, can't deal with that. I compartmentalize it, and now I'm going to go through the rest of my life. And she gets haunted by the Babadook, this guy named Mr. Babadook, and it's just awful and terrible. Steve just watched it recently, and he was messed up by it too.
Thank you.
But here's what happens at the end. At the end, her son is watching his mom basically like lose it. And again, this is like a metaphor, a riff on grief. Like, how do we process real loss in our life? And he comes to her and says, Mom, you, what's the line? You can't live without the Babadook. And she's like, what? And as soon as that, like her son says, he's always with you, she changes, she goes down and says, and like confronts him and says, you can't terrorize me anymore. And it's not like he disappears or he dies, but now he lives in her basement. And the end is she goes and she feeds him every day. And you're going, whoa, wait a minute. Now we have some filmmakers going, we have these things that are haunting us, that we're wanting to avoid. And their vision is there's some way that we actually have to cultivate our fears. Otherwise, they're going to consume us. So I think that's a really good picture. Or if you saw Stephen King, or not Stephen King's, but the most recent It Part 2. It Part 1, way better movie. And it's all these kids dealing with their own real world traumas. And then Pennywise the Clown, which like I watch a lot of horror movies. Well, I have been. Clowns still, I just can't. I'm just like, no, 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 thank you. And creepy dolls, those are the two. I'm just like, but I did it. I watched It Part 2. But it's really interesting picture. So the kids are all grown up and they all have to beat Pennywise. And it's way overly blown out, like 30-minute scene. It's way too long. Did you see that one? Yeah, he's the director. I think he agrees. It's too long. But he gets huge. He's like tarantula Pennywise. And they all get together. And the way they defeat this thing that's been traumatizing them is together as a community, they basically put him in his place. And they actually start saying, you're actually kind of a joke. You know, you're just a silly clown. And they verbalize the fact that their trauma, their grief, their fears had actually been blown up to this thing that until they actually got around and said, actually, you're not the thing that we're going to allow control our lives and consume our lives. And this is actually how they defeat the great enemy of the clown. He sort of like literally shrinks down to size in that movie. I think it's a really great picture of, I think where I'm pushing us to say, there's so many things that animate us that are real world traumas or imagined fears that maybe we inherited. I don't know about you, but I grew up born in late 70s, raised in the 80s in a Christian home that was essentially evangelical. I was given a lot of things to fear. Sex was one of them. I'm a Baptist, and if you heard the joke, like Baptists don't approve of sex because it leads to dancing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was what, like, oh man. But like, oh yeah, they mean it, right? Like this kind of the fear of what might happen if you lose your virginity. I'm not overstating it. It was like ultimate. This is an ultimate. We didn't have mortal sins, but we did, right? If you voted Democrat, I was raised in certain places where it's like it's mind blowing. If you were anybody that wasn't strictly heteronormative, you were threatening the core of the gospel. I had a lot of things that were built into me that were fears, leveraged to get me to be faithful. Never couched as fear, and these drive the evangelical imagination, but I think human imagination. And if we never turn around and go like, well, how did purity culture steer me in certain relationships? Like, what is that all about? Who did I fear? Who was I pointed? What kind of people? All these sort of things, I think, get in the way in ways that are really unhealthy psychologically, but then theologically in terms of how we engage in ministry. And I just kind of tire, like Kenneth, I was youth pastor, young adults pastor, etc. And I'm just going, I ran out of tools, I think. And all those tools taught me really well how to steer people towards the passage is always like, focus on whatever is true and good and upright, and beautiful and worthwhile. And my quick thing, if you listen to podcasts, I go pretty quick there. I'm like, but we forget what's true. That we're supposed to meditate on what is true. And what is true about most of our lives is that often the truth is horrific. And if our calling is to be people of truth, I don't think we have any other choice. That was a really long-winded way to answer your question, but
So one quick follow-up.
yeah.
Open up. So what is that? And this we've had a side conversation, but I'm interested
Okay.
in what you think about this, and it might be for a group. I think one of the things we realize is as we read the scriptures, we recognize that marginalized communities have a lot to say about their hermeneutics and the way that we think about the gospel and everything else. Like, I was really intrigued by a conversation that we had where you were talking about horror movies and the rising amount of females who are directors and people of color that are making amazing films. And I wonder if they actually have something more to speak to that because of the trauma that they've experienced in life. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of speak to how, minority voices and marginalized voices have contributed to this industry.
Well, let me tell you how marginalized voice. I'll say something and hand it to you because I want to hear if you think, I don't know if we've talked about this directly. So interesting to hear if I like what I'm thinking is right. So yes, I find really the Babadook is by a female filmmaker and it's really interesting. We have a whole panel on women in horror, if you're interested in that, and how they experience it, because horror has not been really kind to women or people of color historically, in the way they're framed. Most of the filmmakers were white males making films for young white males. So it made some sense, but things have changed. I think, so that Lovecraft Country movie I saw, or show, a Black woman, Misha Green, and I think what I experience when I watch her piece of art is for a minute, I get to feel, because I think art traffics in empathy, right? Like that's, and a filmmaker makes you feel, that's what they're doing. You might go think about it, whatever, but if they don't make you feel, it's a failure. And for a second, I get to feel what it's like to inhabit a Black woman's body in the world. I never will really know that, but to know the kind of world that she just walks around in, where she is an object of a threat. Her body is constantly under threat in a way that I'll never really feel just walking around the streets here. But when I walk into her film and she hands that to me, I get this moment where I am deeply unsettled, and that's exactly how it should be. Like I should feel as unsettled as she feels every single day of her life. And that's a gift. That's something that I don't know how we do otherwise in film. And it's something like when I watch Kenneth's film, same sort of thing. I go, Kenneth could tell me all day long about his community, his church, what he deals with, thinking about the kids seeing, Asian bodies being violated all the time. But until I watched Refuse, I'm like, okay, I got it. Now I get it. But I don't know if you are thinking that way when you're making the movie at all, in terms of the question that Steve's asking.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, one of the things I was grappling with was the idea that, okay, so Asian American young adults, I think it's 15 to 25. We're the only group where suicide is the #1 killer for young adults. Like that's the only ethnicity. And at the same time, it's the least likeliest group to go get therapy because of the way that mental health crisis is stigmatized. So a lot of that was in consideration with thinking about somebody who is a meth addict. And if you know anything about meth, like you actually hear and see things, but a real life demon is right before him, but nobody believes him because he is this messed up. And so it's almost like, here's somebody from an invisible group that's ultra invisible. And I think going back to the Legion story is like, it's no coincidence to me that the thing that's plaguing this man, he names it after the Roman battalion, right? So it's like, here's a group of people who are under Roman siege, and here's somebody that's dealing with mental crisis or dealing with something spiritually. So it's like marginalized, and he's like the marginal of the marginal. And so I think the film tried to go to like the extreme of what somebody could face. Yeah, so definitely took that into consideration as I was making. So
it's probably related to that. I think what we're both trying to do what you're getting, like push to sort of a deeper discomfort. Like it's easier said than done, right? Like it's easier said to go like, oh, I'm going to inhabit somebody else's vision of the world. It's really uncomfortable. It's even more uncomfortable to come back out of it and go, okay, I can't be the same. I can't operate in the world as I did before, given what I just experienced. But if you're not, if you're not willing to jump in there with them, it's dead on arrival. And so I think it's not easy, but it's worth it. I think, in many ways.
We have a few more minutes. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay.
I'll preface this by saying I don't like horror movies, so I fall into that category. I remember 5 years old, sneaking downstairs and peering into the living room when my parents were watching like the OG It, and like I've never watched a horror movie since. But horror movies are compelling, as you said. I mean, people go see them. I think about like, what's the Saw franchise just released their like 10th movie, you know, that's wild. And I don't think people maybe go for the gratuitous violence. My understanding is that there are these themes of like, you know, divine judgment and redemption and, you know, even faith in there. And I know what y'all are doing is much, much deeper than like an undergrad course on like faith and film, but I keep thinking about how compelling this idea of horror is, because I think it does make us reckon with sort of the things that we are afraid of, whether we get forced there or observing other people going through it. I just find that compelling.
And again, you don't have to go to horror booths to it, but if you're not finding some space yourself and then creating space for others to reckon with those fears, that's the problem. Horror doesn't answer everything, right? In fact, it creates some problems in some cases. But I think part of the fascination with it, as Kenneth's saying, like of how profitable it is, how many people are going to see these, how many more they just keep churning out. There's a handful of reasons. One, there is the sort of like the group that's just pure sort of titillation, right? Like, can I do it? What's more grotesque? I mean, that's part of it, but that's every piece of art in every contemporary media. Like, it's not just horror films. But there's a communal element to it, especially young people. Like psychologically, actually, it's interesting. If you watch gazelles and lions, they operate in the same space a lot. And young gazelles especially work together to get close to lions and see how close they can get. Because what they're doing is they're training, like, how do I figure out when I actually need to run from the lion? And how do I do this together? And there's a practice threat response in different sort of safe spaces. And so horror films become a safe space for young people in particular. That's why they're even more drawn to them, to actually rehearse, what do I do if I'm facing a crisis? What do I do if I'm facing a threat to my life? how will I feel? And what do I make of those feelings? And what, and then sometimes it's like, I bring my girlfriend and she sees that I'm pretty tough and that's good. Or, so there's all that stuff, but it creates a space where they're actually able to navigate it. And I keep going, a decade of youth ministry, I don't ever remember thinking intentionally about where in my youth ministry am I creating space for the teenagers to get together and practice threat response. I don't know what that would look like, right? But a couple other things is I do think it's a deep spiritual hunger. Most of the it's really interesting to hear you talk about people not believing you, right? Like I see a demon and talked to a woman a new film called Appendage is coming out on Hulu. It's okay. But it's all about mental health. And she said mental health in particular is horror, because horror is about, do I believe it or not? Is it real or not? And she's like, as someone suffering from depression, anxiety, the response I often get, even internally and from others is, depression's not real. And I'm like, what? And she's like, the way that makes you crazy is like a horror movie, right? And so I thought, is it real or not? Is spiritual reality real or not? Are there extra human forces at work in the world? How do I explain the inexplicable things that I encounter? I think the rise in interest in horror films is a reflection of a society, at least in the US, that has lost spaces to explore those questions. And horror films hand it up on a platter. A lot of them are actually supernatural, so the spirituality is there on the surface, but those that aren't are getting at those sort of deeper things that I would call spiritual anyway. And it's just no small wonder. So I do theology in films. So that's part of why I go to horror, because I go, when a phenomenon gets to that level, I can't ignore it anymore. Like, I don't like horror films, but if that many people are going that often and consuming that much media, it's sort of like a professional obligation for me to go, well, what's that about? Like, and the way I do theology, conventional theology, is I basically say, I start with the question of what's God up to in the world? And then how can I participate? My starting assumption missionally is God's present and active in all places and all times, before I get there and long after I leave. My job is just to figure out what in the world's going on and how I might best participate. And so I'm going, something's happening in the horror genre. And I'm trying to figure out, sort of reverse engineer, now what's my role and what God's already up to there. And sometimes it's calling out, hey, did you know that's, we've thought about that for 2,000 years. That happens a lot, actually, like in Nun 2, some interesting theology that goes on. But in other cases, it's just sitting with someone in their grief. In other cases, it's a follow-up conversation. And every person's a little bit different, but I do think just culturally we're at this sort of inflection point where people are really expressing that sort of spiritual hunger that we see in horror films. Am I off? Is that one?
I was just gonna say, I think this is so needed. Like, I'm nervous talking because I was a little afraid and all that stuff, but I think it's just so needed. I think about a couple things. So I served in, if you think anybody's taken CPE, know that you got to deal with stuff. And so, I worked in the hospital for a while as a chaplain and worked in the children's hospital and saw a lot of horrible things, a lot that were done to kids that came through the ER, but that is reality and it's happening and we need to confront that. And we were talking about today, the headline of the little girl that was kidnapped in New York, but they found her, today, I guess, but a parent's worst nightmare of a child being kidnapped, but that is happening all the time. And we need things like this and conversations like this to talk about the hard things that people deal with daily. I don't know everybody's story in here, but we've all been through, I'm sure, some horror in our families or in our lives. And it just makes us, like you said, confront the fears. And even as pastors, to deal with this and not be afraid and run from it. Morgan, you could speak to this a little more, but how we were talking about how the church is outsourcing dealing with the mental health issue in the church and the things that are happening, and how we as pastors and youth leaders and workers have to deal with this stuff. We have to confront it and not outsource it to somebody else if they come to us. And this is just, I think, a good resource and just good conversation to make us push the envelope about the hard things that happen. Like we all go through a lot of hard things. And I know we don't always want to talk about them, but this is a must. So thank you.
Burnout, you're welcome. And I mean, we're just making books. You guys are doing the hard work. But burnout's at all-time high. It's no small wonder that pastors are quitting a lot in the US right now for that very reason, I think. Just an interesting possibility. She now is the dean of school psychology, but if any of you get a chance to do any like trauma-informed ministry classes in the DMin or whatnot, do it. It's life-changing in terms of like how you think about what your obligation is as a on-the-ground pastor and minister. But the other more, maybe I don't want to overly intellectualize it based on what you're saying, but the fear rightly thing is real in the sense that, you know, whether it's a kidnapping or something. I mean, my parents, the kidnapping, it was the satanic panic, right, of the time. It's like, our kids are going to get kidnapped, and it's like, why are you afraid of that? That's not a thing you should be afraid of, you know, fill in the blank. And one of the things when it comes to kids and who we're encountering, this is a good example. I was trying to find a concrete example back to your question, Steve, of so I'm ordained Southern Baptist. And the Southern Baptist, if you know, the last couple of years has not been great. I'm actually on the way out, if you want to know. I'm a free agent right now. But one of the things they totally screwed up was their own clergy abuse, sexual abuse of minors and women, and the cover-up. And the reason that I would think this is not demonic, structurally demonic. When you get otherwise faithful people that are in leadership positions saying, we're going to cover up these abuses and introduce other kids to further abuse because we're afraid of what might happen if the truth is revealed. We're driven by fear, and that fear drives us to do things that actually perpetuate further harm. Instead of going, let's actually face what's in the box, and that is we have pastors sexually abusing kids. That was too traumatic. It was too horrific. We didn't want to face it. Nobody wants to face that. I don't want to face it, but it's the truth, right? Whatever is true and good. And we're focused on these things. And that was too true that we looked away. And instead we covered it up because we were afraid, and you'll hear this if you read the SBC stuff, we were afraid of the damage it might do to the gospel if people found out. And that is, I think, a perfect example of how fear crops up in these ways if we don't address it, if we don't actually stare into the horror and say, the gospel calls us there. And okay, I'm not going to mic drop, but it's the end of the class.
I had a question.
Please go. Yeah, I know. I have one last thing I can say about the gospel and horror, but ask your question and then we can leave or go get a beer or something.
So I feel like you kind of started at this very ground level, almost like practical theology, right?
Yep.
Like real lived stories,
Yep.
Real trauma, whatever is true.
Yep.
And so kind of making the movement from that up towards like theology and like the implications this has on that is, okay, so the Bible says like fear not, right? But we're given like apocalyptic literature, right? These things I think that were meant to instill fear. And so if you do this work to desensitize yourself to anxiety and fear and death, what relationship does that have to our understanding of a need of a savior? Right? And like salvation, you know, like I see what you're saying, and I also just wonder about that theological aspect.
So let me just restate it to see if I'm getting your question right. So your concern would be if we, let's say, kind of process through our fears, and so that we're not, we don't have fears, that then why would we need a savior? Is that why you're asking?
I think I'm saying there is like a certain aspect of healthy fear that participates in like the whole idea of salvation, right? And like just eschatological whatever things.
Yeah, I think, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so just so I'm theologically clear, yeah, I think we should have fear. So that's where I was saying the fear of the Lord. Now that would mean, sometimes we speak of it in terms of like awe or, respect or something like that. But yeah, there should be, I think, it's back to the fearing rightly. We say we're afraid of all these other things when in fact we're afraid of this. So Adam says, I was afraid. Why? Because I was naked. But he'd been naked, like what? No, he wasn't. That's like a lie. He or lying to himself, to God, whatever. What he was afraid of were the implications of his misdirected desire, that he allowed something that wasn't God to be in the place of God, and there were consequences for that. I mean, and yet he's saying, this is my fear. He should have feared what God told him to fear, and he didn't. And because of that, you need God. So like, I think it gets back to that. You can talk more on the side if you want. But I also think that as we think theologically about it, and it's a good setup to what the final thing I was going to say is, at the end of Mark, the regular ending, there's the capped on ending, right? Is, you guys remember what the actual short ending is? What the women run away, what? Afraid. Like, and when anytime Jesus is announced to people, what are they first? Afraid. So the fear not is always a command in light of legitimate fear. Before God, before the incarnation, the human response is terror, because that's who God is. If God is the God that we claim God to be, God should strike fear into our hearts. At the end, I don't want to get too cute with it, but with Brad Pitt, may his name be praised. When he comes to the end of himself, and I've been actually interviewing people that exorcists. I've been interviewing people that have gone through exorcisms, people that are not Christian that have witnessed it and done these things. It's fascinating, and this comes up in the horror genre a lot, where when the human gets to the end of themselves, the only thing they know to do is to pray, and you get all these like secular prayers to God, and you hear Brad Pitt when he finally goes in, what he says is God, 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 right before he shoots the dude, right? Like, what am I going to do in light of this trauma? I have no other response other than to throw myself at the mercy of the only thing I don't even know, right? It's like this sort of stuttered prayer that comes out. I think that's what a healthy fear of God is. Now, God also loves us. God is our Abba. I mean, this is fantastic. But fear is not a bad thing to feel in light of the creator of all that is. Like, that's pretty healthy.